And if you can go in with that emptiness in a good way, with that purified vessel, then nature is extremely generous and extremely healing and extremely enlightening in what it can provide. But it's a relationship, because you put yourself in that in terms of a relationship as you do with a person. So it takes two energies to flow together to make that actually dynamically function. And in the city, there's no question of that really occurring, because it's not about that. The city is a purely three-dimensional construct in terms of its success and its artistry. But in a higher dimensional sense, it's a very, very challenging environment, and it ultimately is something that cannot be dwelt in indefinitely. And again, I say that just to temper with common sense. I actually love New York. It's probably my favorite city. But to dwell in it 24/7 all year round, now for me, is no longer viable, because I've been doing a certain amount of work with my energy system that makes that just not feasible anymore. It's not something I can do. So there has to be a distinction between what is cohesive and what flows together, and what is decoherent and what, is antagonistic to purifying one's vessel. And that's really, we can come up with lots of specific examples, but that is the root of the thing, is that. And you can think of any objects in either camp, or any things, or any patterns, or any behaviors in either category, and you can quickly start to discern what is organic and what is synthetic, what is coherent and what is decoherent.
That's a fabulous perspective. I appreciate that. Thanks, Neil.
You're welcome.
And next we have Uranus Rising.
Thanks, Neil, for joining us. It's a delight to speak with you. And
hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, I've been following your work for a while, so this is an honor for me. My first question to you is, English philosopher and writer Iris Murdoch said, "We live in a fantasy world, a world of illusion. The great task in life is to find reality. Finding reality is knowing what is real inside ourselves as well as in the world. But too often we are searching outside ourselves for reality. And given that we are living in a highly controlled and managed false reality or world of illusion, perceptions of reality can be problematic. Would you please speak of how we can build discernment skills and a multidisciplinary approach to looking at and experiencing existence?"
That's a great question. To some degree, we talked just now about being aware of what is coherent and what is decoherent, what works, what flows, and what doesn't flow. And I think from my understanding and my studies and so on, this is what starts to mark out mystical thinking from purely philosophical thinking. And it's actually great to hear Iris Murdoch's name mentioned as well. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Really interesting work.
Yes.
I think all good philosophers have a mystical impulse. And I think it's something that is fundamental to answer this question, which is about building these discernment skills. And as you say, a very important point, the multidisciplinary approach. And I think that is what starts to mark out the mystic from the pure philosopher in a very positive way. And that is why, I've discussed this recently actually, but people like Jacob Boehme and Blavatsky and Gurdjieff as mystics, although they had some occasional sort of trickery and even naughtiness to some of the things they did, what they had over the philosophers was a particular focus on felt experience, on direct gnosis, rather than pure conceptual knowledge. And they also did have a multidisciplinary awareness, in that they understood that to build a true picture of what we find ourselves in here and how we can interact with it in a very positive manner, we have to accept that a lot of that data is splattered all over the place in some places we might expect, like universities and libraries and Western traditions, but also in the jungles of South America and in Victorian occultism and in Egyptian mystery school traditions. And some of it's tucked away in Estonia, and other parts of it are hidden in castles in Bavaria. And some of it is in the garden in your own home, where you sit there and look at the tomatoes grow. And some of it is in the relationships you have with people. And they realize that, yeah, you really do have to contact that at all levels, because it actually is one thing. And to just be a specialist in one area, to just study one discipline, whether that's something apparently worthy, like a Kabbalistic study, which doubtless has many interesting aspects to it and can certainly teach you about the way things are pieced together for my money in a more cogent way than most physics would do, nevertheless leaves out things like considerations of Atlantis or considerations of extraterrestrial intelligence, which cannot be left out of the picture, basically. They cannot be left out. And so if you do have the privilege of being able to operate independently as a mystical philosopher, which is, again, something that we can all do quite naturally and quite well, then you don't have any hang-ups and you don't have any beliefs to say, well, I can't say the word divinity, or I can't contemplate this strange mythical civilization Atlantis. You're not bothered about that. You just go where the resonance is strong. So you follow those paths wherever they lead, and you also bring that knowledge into your own domain as you see fit. And that is important principle of this. As to how we actually do that, again, I've spoken about this recently, but the discernment necessary is important, and the discipline necessary is important, because you will meet people who are interested in mysticism who just fly off on some wild theories and say, yeah, this thing about the moon seems very, very plausible, and I'm with that now, but I'm a fake moon person now, or I'm a no planes person now, or I'm a this or I'm a that. And some of those things you could think, well, actually that's quite important, because it is important to look at the origin of the moon, because there's something interesting going on there. Very, very old observance. There's nothing to do with modern researchers, in my view. And there is something interesting about no planes on 9/11, which to some people is just a horrific thought. That, what on earth are you talking about? And yet, if you throw yourself into that with no discipline and no scholarly abilities, then not only do you trip yourself up, but you also look foolish to others who might want to listen to what you've got to say, and who you might have an interest in sharing and learning from yourself. So there is the case that this autodidactic impulse of being one's own independent scholar, we have to learn that we train ourselves to be a scholar, in that we have to learn how to read, and we have to learn how to write, and how to cross-reference properly, and how to weigh a theory based on evidence or consensus or personal belief or experience. How do we test it? Are those things important? Is consensus relevant anymore, or is it not? Is it all subjective? All these things have to be put into that sort of crucible of your own scholarly attitude and your own mentation on this. And you have to formulate what you think, and you can't really delude yourself on this for very long anyway. You have to formulate what you think is your own best form of scholarship. If this theory is so important, how are you genuinely best to test it? How do you run with it? How does that work? And everybody knows what that feels like for themselves. And it's not just hard work. You have to use intuition as well. You can't just smash everything with a hammer of critical reason, because it'll just, ultimately leave you with very little. You have to use your intuition. You have to use your feminine and your masculine energies. And you have to realize that fundamentally, the principle of mysticism is that these people are attempting to make contact with ultimate reality, which, as Iris Murdoch says, yes, this is a world of illusion, and it is a world of fantasy in a sense. And we can't ignore that, but neither can we ignore what the illusion presents us with, which is chairs and tables and politicians and wars and greed and hunger and so on and so forth. We can't ignore those things. You know, we are physical beings as well. But the key to it is, the key to the discernment skills is to understand that a lot of approaches are relevant and valid to understanding these key observations. And they are, in my view, philosophy is key. And there are a group of half a dozen philosophers, I think, who pin it down very well. And if one is interested in who those are, then you soon come that there's another 12 as well who follow up on some other points. So there's a bunch of philosophers that one will gravitate towards, but they leave out a lot of spiritual material. So then one finds oneself looking at, particularly in my personal life, Zen, Buddhism, and traditions that have a distinct focus on spiritual aspect, like Chinese Taoism, for example. But none of those things have the answer. They have perspectives. They have perspectives. And no tradition and no system of exploration worth a damn will have any very hard, rigorous doctrines. So if I come across a doctrine in Zen, I'm dropping that school of thought straight away. If I come across a doctrine in Taoism, I'm dropping that straight away. Because some of these things, although they start off pure, and you might look at an interesting teacher like Sung San, a Zen teacher, or of course Lao Tzu, a Taoist teacher, that gets compromised over time, and what somebody might call a Zen school or a Taoist school is actually quite far from what it originally was. So you have to create your own formulation of what that means. And sooner or later, as you do that, and this is the key to the question really, you realize that contacting truth is a transcendent experience. It's not words on a page, and it's not even just experiences in your hands. It's something that moves you completely out of just being Neil Kramer or Fred Smith or Sarah Jones. It moves you out of that entirely, and it transcends ordinary comprehension of the world. And it is fundamentally a union with something outside of oneself, which I would very simply describe as a higher dimensional or a fourth dimensional experience. And you're talking about immediate, like matrix-style download of a whole concept in its entirety, perfectly articulated and elucidated. There's no need to go through a linear process to get to it. So you can have a fabulous philosopher like Martin Heidegger who goes into tremendous detail and like chews his own ears off, you know, going into like this mind-wrenching sort of vortex of philosophy and labyrinths of intellectualism, and it's just all really masturbatory from a higher perspective. And without it is, and without the spirit element, it loses something pretty fundamental. But what those people do teach us, and I would say Hegel is probably a better example of someone who melds the two quite well, is that you do need some sort of disciplinary approach, and quite frankly, the philosophers teach us well how that works, often better than the mystics. But the mystics have kind of more balls in a way, and that they'll push themselves out into areas that they actually don't know, and they don't really understand, and they don't really have a grasp of, and yet they pioneer in these areas, risking what, but come back with something that